Private Chen's radio crackled with static at 0400 hours, January 22nd, 1945. Hürtgen Forest. His platoon had walked into a German trap, and now 32 men were surrounded with no ammunition resupply and no way out. Chen had one working frequency, and maybe 10 minutes before the enemy closed the circle. Could he talk a P-47 pilot through the fog to drop supplies in a landing zone the size of a baseball diamond? The radio had taken shrapnel, half the dials were shattered. His lieutenant was counting on him. Every man in that frozen clearing was counting on him. Chen keyed the mic, voice steady, despite the mortars falling closer. He'd never guided an airdrop before. The pilot couldn't see the ground. The Germans were 300 yards out and advancing. Chen looked at his watch, then at the sky, and started talking. The Hürtgen Forest was a nightmare made of trees. 50 square miles of dense pine and fir, steep ravines, narrow fire breaks, limited visibility in every direction. The Germans had fortified it for months. Bunkers, pillboxes, minefields, interlocking fields of fire. Every path was a death trap. Every clearing was a killing zone. American forces had been fighting here since September. 4 months of grinding combat. Some of the worst casualties of the entire war. Divisions went in at full strength and came out shattered. The forest ate men, chewed them up and spit them out, and still the fighting continued. Chen's platoon had entered the forest 3 days ago, part of a company-sized patrol, reconnaissance mission. Find the German positions. Report back. Simple orders. Impossible execution. They'd found the Germans all right. Or rather, the Germans had found them. Ambush at dawn on day 2. Machine guns from 3 directions. Mortars raining down. Half the company dead or wounded in the first 5 minutes. The rest scattered into the trees, running, hiding, trying to survive. Chen's platoon had regrouped in a small clearing. 32 men out of the original 40. Lieutenant Morrison was in command now. Captain Harris was dead. So were both sergeants. Morrison was 23 years old, 6 months out of OCS. Good officer, smart, calm under pressure, but he'd never been in a situation like this. Nobody had. Morrison came from Virginia. Old family. Military tradition going back to the Civil War. He'd been educated at WWII. Commissioned as a second lieutenant in 1944. Shipped overseas 3 months later. Found himself commanding a platoon of veterans who'd seen more combat than he had. He'd handled it well, listened to his sergeants, made smart decisions, earned respect. Now his sergeants were dead. Staff Sergeant Williams had taken a machine gun burst to the chest in the initial ambush. Sergeant Kowalski had been hit by mortar fragments trying to rally the men. Both dead before anyone could help them. Morrison was alone now. A young officer with 32 lives depending on his decisions. The platoon was a mix of veterans and replacements. Some had been fighting since Normandy. Others had joined in the last month. They'd bonded quickly. Combat did that. Shared fear created brotherhood faster than anything else. Private Rodriguez was the point man, Mexican-American from Texas. Quiet, observant, could spot an ambush before anyone else knew something was wrong. He'd been first to realize they were walking into a trap, had shouted the warning, saved lives with those few seconds of advance notice. Corporal Thompson was the medic. From Minnesota, big guy. Gentle hands, could patch a wound while bullets were flying and never seemed to notice the danger. He was working now, moving from man to man, treating injuries, conserving supplies, doing what medics did when there weren't enough supplies and too many wounded. Private O'Brien was the BR man, Irish kid from Boston, carried the Browning automatic rifle, like it weighed nothing, laid down suppressive fire that had stopped 2 German advances already. His ammunition was running low. They all were. These were the men who would live or die based on what happened in the next hour. These were the faces Chen saw when he looked around the clearing. scared, exhausted, determined, trusting their lieutenant to save them, trusting Chen to get help. The Germans had them surrounded, 300 yards in every direction, close enough to hear their voices, close enough to see their muzzle flashes, too close for comfort, too far to break through. The platoon was trapped. Chen estimated 50 to 60 Germans in the encirclement. Maybe more, probably more. They'd been careful, patient, had waited until the American patrol was deep in the forest before springing the trap. Professional soldiers, experienced fighters, they knew exactly what they were doing. The German commander was smart too, kept probing, testing, looking for weak points, never committed to a full assault until he was sure of victory. He could afford to wait. Time was on his side. The Americans were running out of ammunition, running out of options. Every hour that passed made the German position stronger. The Germans had them surrounded. 300 yards in every direction, close enough to hear their voices, close enough to see their muzzle flashes, too close for comfort, too far to break through. The platoon was trapped. Ammunition was running low. They'd been fighting for 36 hours, burning through rounds. No resupply possible. The supply lines were cut. The roads were blocked. Airdrops were the only option. But airdrops required communication, required coordination, required someone who knew what they were doing. That someone was Private First Class David Chen, radio operator, 20 years old, from San Francisco, the only man in the platoon who could work the SCR-300 radio, the only link to the outside world, the only hope for 32 surrounded men. Chen had joined the army in 1943. Drafted like everyone else, went through basic at Camp Roberts, got assigned to Signal Corps training because he'd worked at his father's electronics repair shop, learned Morse code, learned radio procedures, learned how to maintain and operate the SCR-300, shipped to Europe in October 1944, been in combat for 3 months now. His father had taught him everything about radios. Old Man Chen ran the only electronics repair shop in Chinatown, small storefront on Grant Avenue, cramped space filled with vacuum tubes and soldering irons and half-dismantled receivers. David had grown up in that shop, learned to read schematics before he could read English properly, learned the difference between a resistor and a capacitor before he learned long division. The old man was patient, never rushed, never lost his temper. When a radio wouldn't work, he'd sit with it for hours, listen to it, test each component, feel his way to the problem. David watched and learned, absorbed his father's methods. His patience, his intuition, the ability to diagnose problems that couldn't be seen, only heard, only felt. His father died in 1942, heart attack, sudden and final. David was 19. Had to take over the shop, keep the family fed, support his mother and 2 younger sisters. He did it for a year, fixed radios and televisions for the people of Chinatown, made enough to keep everyone housed and fed. Then the draft notice came. Basic training at Camp Roberts was brutal. California heat, endless marching, drill sergeants who screamed until their voices cracked. David was smaller than most recruits. 5'6", 140 pounds, not built for infantry work, but he kept up, never complained, did whatever they asked. The army noticed his background, asked about the electronics shop, about the radio repairs, sent him to Signal Corps training at Fort Monmouth, 12 weeks learning military communications, the SCR-300 backpack radio, the SCR-536 handheld, Morse code, voice procedures, radio discipline, how to call in artillery, how to coordinate with air support, how to keep communications flowing when everything else was falling apart. David excelled, top of his class. The instructors said he had a gift, could hear things in static that others missed, could diagnose equipment problems by sound alone, could stay calm when radios failed, and commanders screamed and everything depended on getting a signal through. They shipped him to England in August 1944, part of a replacement pool, fresh bodies to fill gaps left by Normandy casualties. He spent 2 months training, learning the terrain, learning the tactics, learning what combat really meant as opposed to what the manuals said. His first assignment was the 28th Infantry Division, Pennsylvania National Guard unit. Good soldiers, battle-hardened from the hedgerow fighting. They'd been through Normandy, through the breakout, through the push across France. Now they were refitting for the next campaign, the next push into Germany. David joined the communications platoon. Radio operator, one of 6. They rotated assignments, supported different companies on different operations, learned the rhythm of combat, the sounds of German weapons versus American ones, the way to dig a foxhole that might actually protect you, the importance of staying calm when bullets were flying. His first combat was in October. Small engagement, German patrol encountered near the Belgian border. David's job was to maintain communication with headquarters, report positions, call for support if needed. He'd done it mechanically, by the book, hands shaking the whole time but voice steady. The engagement lasted 20 minutes. 2 Germans killed, no American casualties. A minor skirmish by war standards, a lifetime experience for David. More followed, bigger engagements, more complicated situations. David learned to adapt, to improvise, to keep the radio working when shrapnel tore through equipment and batteries died and antennas got shot away. He became known as reliable, the radio operator you wanted when things got bad. Then came the Hürtgen. The Hürtgen Forest was hell on earth. Everyone who fought there said the same thing. The trees were the enemy as much as the Germans. Dense pine forests that blocked out the sun, branches that caught artillery shells and turned them into airbursts. No cover, no concealment, just green darkness and death. David's division entered the forest on January 19, 1945, part of a larger offensive. Pushed through to the Roda River, opened the path for the final drive into Germany. Simple objectives, impossible execution. The first day was bad. The second was worse. The Germans knew the forest, had fortified every position, had zeroed their artillery on every path. American units advanced in yards, not miles, lost men with every step. The forest floor was littered with bodies. American and German both, frozen, forgotten, part of the landscape now. David's platoon was attached to a reconnaissance company, 40 men, mission probe ahead of the main advance, find the German positions, report back, standard recon work, dangerous but necessary. They'd found the Germans all right, or rather the Germans had found them. He'd called in artillery before, done it dozens of times. Adjust fire, correct for range. Walk the shells onto target. Standard procedure, but he'd never guided an airdrop. Never talked a pilot through fog. Never had 32 lives depending on his voice and a half-broken radio. The radio had taken shrapnel during the initial ambush. A fragment had punched through the case, damaged the frequency selector. Half the dials were frozen. Chen had one working frequency. Just one. If that frequency was wrong, if no one was listening, if the signal didn't reach, they were all dead. Lieutenant Morrison crouched beside him, face streaked with dirt and blood, eyes red from exhaustion, voice calm despite everything. "Can you reach anyone?" Morrison asked. Chen adjusted the antenna, checked the battery, keyed the mic. "This is Foxtrot 27 calling any station. Emergency. Repeat. Emergency. Foxtrot 27 requesting immediate assistance. Over." Static. Nothing but static. Chen tried again. Same result. He adjusted the squelch. Tried a third time. More static. Then, faintly, a voice. Distant, broken, but there. "Foxtrot 27, this is Ramrod 6. Read you weak but clear. State your emergency. Over. Chen felt his heart surge. Ramrod 6. That was a P-47 call sign. Fighter bomber. Close air support. If he could talk to them, if they could help, maybe there was a chance. Ramrod 6. Foxtrot 27. We are surrounded. 32 personnel. Low ammunition. Request emergency supply drop. Grid reference follows. Chen read off the coordinates. Prayed they were accurate. Prayed the pilot could find them. A long pause. Then the pilot's voice came back. Foxtrot 27, Ramrod 6. Copy your position. We are carrying ordnance, not supplies, but I'm vectoring in a C-47 cargo bird. Call sign Boxcar 3. They're 10 minutes out. Can you hold? 10 minutes. An eternity in combat, but better than nothing. Ramrod 6, Foxtrot 27, will hold. What's the situation on the fog? Ceiling is about 300 feet. Visibility less than half a mile. Boxcar 3 will need ground guidance. Can you provide? Ground guidance. Talk the pilot in blind, through fog so thick you couldn't see 50 yards, to a clearing the size of a baseball diamond, with Germans closing from every direction, with a radio held together by tape and prayer. Chen looked at Morrison. The lieutenant nodded. No choice, had to try. Ramrod 6. Foxtrot 27. Affirmative on ground guidance. We'll mark the DZ with smoke when we hear engines. Over. Copy that. Foxtrot 27. Boxcar 3 will contact you on this frequency. Good luck. Ramrod 6 out. The connection went silent. Chen sat back, looked at the sky. Fog hung in the trees like wet cotton. Visibility was maybe 40 yards. The sun wouldn't be up for another 2 hours. Even then the fog might not lift. January in the Hürtgen. Cold, wet, grey. Perfect conditions for dying. Morrison gathered the platoon. Explained the situation. Supply drop incoming. 10 minutes. Maybe less. They needed to hold the clearing. Needed to create a drop zone. Needed to stay alive long enough to receive the supplies. The men responded with grim determination. They'd been fighting for 36 hours. Exhausted, hungry, scared, but not beaten, not yet. They still had ammunition. Not much, but enough for 10 minutes. Maybe. Chen set up his position near the center of the clearing. Best spot for radio contact. Worst spot for survival. He'd be exposed, vulnerable, an obvious target. But he needed clear sky above him, needed unobstructed transmission, couldn't do his job from behind a tree. He checked the radio again. Battery was holding. Signal was weak but stable. The one working frequency was still working. For now, Chen said, a silent prayer to whatever God was listening, to his ancestors, to anyone who might help. The Germans attacked at 0407 hours, probing assault, testing the perimeter, machine gun fire raked the trees. Mortars fell in the clearing. Chen pressed himself into the frozen ground, felt the concussions through his chest, heard the screams of wounded men. Morrison directed the defense. Calm, professional, repositioning men, concentrating fire, conserving ammunition. The Germans pulled back after 3 minutes. Not a serious assault, just harassment. Letting the Americans know they were there, letting them know they were coming. Chen checked his watch. 0410. Boxcar 3 should be close. He keyed the mic. Boxcar 3. This is Foxtrot 27. Do you read? Over. Static. Long seconds of nothing. Then a voice, clear and steady. Foxtrot 27, Boxcar 3. We read you. Approaching your position from the southwest. ETA 5 minutes. What's your situation? Boxcar 3. We are under fire. Germans approximately 300 yards in all directions. Fog ceiling 300 feet. Visibility 40 yards on the ground. DZ is a clearing approximately 50 yards diameter. We will mark with smoke. Over. Copy, Foxtrot 27. 50 yards is tight. Very tight. We need you to talk us in. Can you do that? Chen swallowed hard. 50 yards was impossible. Supply drops usually needed clearings twice that size. The margin for error was 0. One wrong instruction, and the supplies would land in the trees, or in German positions, or on top of American soldiers. Boxcar 3, Foxtrot 27. Affirmative. I will talk you in. What's your approach altitude? We'll come in at 350, just above the fog. We'll need you to tell us when to drop. You'll have to time it perfectly. Perfectly. Like that was possible. Chen had never done this before, had no training for it, was working with a damaged radio and failing nerves, but 32 men were counting on him. 32 men would die if he failed. Copy, Boxcar 3. I'll do my best. Signal when you're 1 minute out. Roger that. Boxcar 3 standing by. Chen looked around the clearing. Men crouched behind trees, behind fallen logs, behind anything that might stop a bullet. They were watching him, depending on him, trusting him to bring salvation from the sky. He thought about his father. Old man Chen ran an electronics shop in San Francisco, fixed radios and vacuum tubes for a living, taught David everything he knew about circuits and signals, died of a heart attack in 1942, never saw his son go to war, never knew David would end up in a frozen forest with a broken radio and 32 lives in his hands. What would his father say? Probably something about staying calm, about trusting the equipment, about doing the job one step at a time. Don't think about failure. Just focus on the next task, the next adjustment, the next transmission. Chen took a deep breath, steadied himself. He could do this, had to do this. No other choice. The Germans attacked again at 0413. Stronger this time, infantry advancing through the trees, rifle fire from multiple directions. Morrison's men fired back, short bursts, conserving ammunition, making every round count. A mortar round landed 20 feet from Chen. Dirt and snow exploded into the air. He felt fragments whistle past his head. One caught his helmet. Knocked it as cue. Didn't penetrate. Lucky. Again. Hold the line, Morrison shouted. 2 more minutes. Just hold. The men fought. Desperate. Determined. They knew what was coming. Knew the supplies were their only chance. They'd hold until the last bullet. Until the last man. Until Chen brought them salvation or died trying. Chen heard it first. The drone of aircraft engines, distant but distinct. Coming from the southwest, Boxcar 3. The sound of salvation or failure. The sound that would determine if 32 men lived or died. The C-47 was flying at about 200 miles per hour. Chen calculated quickly. At that speed, the plane would cross the clearing in less than a second. He'd have to call the drop at exactly the right moment. Too early and the supplies would land in trees or German positions. Too late and they'd overshoot the clearing entirely. His father had taught him about this. Not about supply drops specifically, about timing, about listening, about calculating distance and speed from sound alone. The old man could tell you how far away a radio station's transmitter was just by listening to the signal quality, could judge the distance to a thunderstorm by counting seconds between lightning and thunder, had passed that skill to his son without ever knowing it would save 32 lives in a frozen forest. Foxtrot 27, Boxcar 3, 1 minute out, ready when you are. Chen's heart pounded. 1 minute, 60 seconds to guide a plane he couldn't see to a clearing he could barely make out, with Germans shooting at him and mortars falling around him. The sound of the engines grew louder. Chen focused, blocked out the gunfire, blocked out the explosions, blocked out the screaming wounded and the shouting soldiers. Just listened to the engines. Just tracked the sound, just calculated. Boxcar 3. Foxtrot 27. I hear your engines. You sound like you're slightly north of our position. Correct south approximately 2 degrees. Correcting south 2 degrees. Confirm. Chen listened. The engine sound shifted, came more directly toward them. Good. His ears weren't lying to him. His calculations were holding. Correction confirmed. You're on track. 30 seconds to DZ. He fumbled for a smoke grenade. Purple smoke, easier to see in fog than red or green. The army had learned that the hard way, too many drops gone wrong because pilots couldn't distinguish colored smoke through weather. Purple stood out. Purple might give the pilot a reference point. Purple might save them. Chen pulled the pin, threw it into the center of the clearing. Purple smoke billowed upward, rose through the fog. Maybe the pilot could see it. Maybe not. Either way, it gave Chen a reference. Gave him something to aim for. Something to visualize when he called the drop. Smoke deployed. Purple smoke in the DZ. Do you see it? Negative on visual. Too much fog. You'll have to call the drop. Call the drop. Blind. Based on sound alone, with a margin of error measured in feet. Chen's hands were shaking now, not from cold, from fear, from the weight of what he was about to do. The pilot's voice came again, calm, professional, trusting. Foxtrot 27. We're releasing 4 bundles. Parachutes will deploy automatically. You've got about 3 seconds between release and ground impact. Call it when you're ready. 3 seconds. That's all. 3 seconds from the moment the pilot released the supplies to the moment they hit the ground. Chen had to account for the plane's speed, altitude, wind drift, and his own position. Had to calculate all of it in his head. Had to get it exactly right. He thought about his father, standing in the shop, soldering iron in hand, explaining how radio waves traveled, how sound propagated, how everything in the universe followed patterns you could learn to read. Trust the physics, David. The physics never lies. Just listen and calculate and trust. Chen closed his eyes, focused on the engine noise, tried to calculate distance, speed, position, all the variables his father had taught him about radio triangulation, about sound propagation, about physics and math and educated guessing. The engine sound grew louder, closer, almost overhead but not quite, coming from the left, still a few degrees off. Boxcar 3, correct right 1 degree. You're almost on target. Correcting right 1 degree. The sound shifted. Centered, coming straight at them now. Chen tracked it in his mind, visualized the plane above the fog, estimated altitude at 350 feet, estimated speed at 180 miles per hour, calculated the forward throw of the bundles, accounted for the 3-second fall time, did the math his father had taught him. The plane was maybe 800 feet away now, coming fast. 5 seconds to optimum release point. 4 seconds. 3. Stand by for drop. 3, 2, 1. Drop, 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 drop. He heard the cargo doors open, heard the rush of air as supplies tumbled out, heard the crack of parachutes deploying, then silence. The plane's engines faded into the fog. Chen held his breath, waited, prayed, to his father's memory, to whatever gods his mother believed in, to anyone or anything that might listen. The first crate crashed through the trees 50 yards to his left. Too far, his heart sank. He'd miscalculated. Failed. 32 men would die because he couldn't do his job, because his father's lessons weren't enough, because impossible really was impossible. Then the second crate landed, 30 yards away, Toza. The parachute had drifted in the fog. Then the third, 20 yards, drifting the same direction. Then the fourth, right in the clearing, 10 feet from the smoke grenade. Dead center. Perfect hit. Chen stared. 4 crates. 1 perfect hit, 3 close enough to retrieve, against all odds, against all logic, against everything that said this was impossible. The physics hadn't lied. His father's lessons had held. The impossible had happened. Boxcar 3, Foxtrot 27, supplies received. 4 crates down. We've got them. The pilot's voice came back warm with relief. Outstanding work, Foxtrot 27. Outstanding. We're heading home. Good luck down there. Boxcar 3 out. The pilot was Captain James Warren, 31 years old, from Nebraska. He'd been flying C-47 cargo runs since D-Day, Normandy drops, Market Garden supplies, Bastogne relief, hundreds of missions, thousands of hours, but he'd never done anything like this before. Blind drop, fog ceiling at 300 feet, visibility 0, landing zone the size of a postage stamp, a voice on the radio telling him when to release. No visual confirmation possible. Just trust, just faith, just doing what the voice said and hoping it was right. Warren had almost refused. Standard procedure said abort if you couldn't see the DZ. Said visual confirmation was required. Said this kind of drop was suicide for the crew and the men below. But the voice on the radio had been steady, calm, professional, had sounded like someone who knew what he was doing. So Warren had trusted, had made the corrections Chen called out, had held the aircraft steady despite the buffeting fog and the invisible forest below, had released when Chen said, release, had felt the aircraft lift as 2,000 pounds of supplies fell away, had turned for home wondering if he'd just killed 32 men or saved them. The answer came 3 days later. A report from Ground Command. Supplies recovered. Patrol extracted. 29 survivors. Mission success. Warren had sat with that report for a long time, tried to understand what had happened, how a kid with a broken radio had guided him to a clearing he couldn't see, how sound alone had been enough, how trust had worked when nothing else could. He'd never learned Chen's full name, just Foxtrot 27, just a voice in the fog, just someone who'd done the impossible because impossible was unacceptable. Warren survived the war, flew commercially for Pan Am for 20 years, retired to Nebraska, died in 1989, but he told the story of that morning to everyone who'd listen. The voice in the fog, the blind drop, the 32 men saved. It was his best story, his proudest moment. Even though someone else had made it possible, even though a kid named Chen had done the real work. That's how legends spread. 2 perspectives, 2 stories, 2 men who never met face to face but worked together through fog and static and faith, each telling their version, each giving credit to the other, each understanding that neither could have done it alone. Chen never knew Warren's name, just Boxcar 3, just a calm voice agreeing to do the impossible, just someone who trusted when trust was all they had. But he was grateful, every day for the rest of his life. Grateful that a pilot from Nebraska had faith in a voice he couldn't see, grateful that trust went both ways, grateful that 2 strangers could work together through fog and save 32 lives. Chen slumped against a tree. Exhaustion hit him like a wave. He'd done it. Somehow, against every odd, he'd talked a plane through fog and delivered salvation to 32 men. But the fight wasn't over. The Germans were still out there, still closing, still determined to kill them all. Chen shook himself. No time for rest, no time for celebration. The supplies had landed, but the battle continued. The impossible was done, but the possible still demanded attention. Morrison organized recovery teams. Men sprinted to the crates, dragged them back to cover, ripped them open. Inside ammunition, grenades, medical supplies, food, water, everything they needed to survive, everything they needed to fight. The men worked fast. Rodriguez and O'Brien hauled the distant crates back through sniper fire. Thompson grabbed the medical supplies. started treating the wounded with proper bandages instead of torn uniforms. Corporal Jackson distributed ammunition, counted magazines, allocated based on position and need, professional, efficient, the way soldiers work when hope returns. Chen sat against his tree, exhausted, drained. He'd done his part. Now it was up to the others, up to the riflemen and the machine gunners and Morrison's tactical mind. His job was done. For now, the men loaded magazines, checked weapons, distributed supplies. Energy surged through the platoon. They had a chance now, a real chance, thanks to Chen, thanks to a broken radio and a voice in the fog. The Germans attacked in force at 0420, full assault, 50 men at least. Maybe more. They'd heard the plane. New supplies had landed, knew they had to finish this before the Americans could use them. But it was too late. The platoon had ammunition now, had grenades, had the will to fight. They met the German assault with concentrated fire, cut down the first wave, staggered the second, drove back the third. O'Brien's bar chattered on the left flank. 20-round magazines emptied and replaced in seconds. The heavy .30 caliber rounds tore through German soldiers trying to advance through the trees. 3 men down. 4, 5. The attack on that flank faltered. Rodriguez held the right with his M1 Garand, calm, methodical. 1 shot per target. 8 rounds in the clip. Reload. 8 more. He'd learned to shoot hunting deer in Texas. Now he hunted men. Same principles. Breathe, aim, squeeze, follow through. Morrison directed it all. Moving behind the line, repositioning men. Plugging gaps, calling out targets. He'd found his footing now, found the calm center that good officers discover in crisis. His voice never rose. His orders were clear. His men trusted him. The fighting lasted 40 minutes. The longest 40 minutes of Chen's life. He crouched behind his tree, fired his carbine when targets appeared, kept the radio ready in case they needed more help, watched men fight and die and survive all around him. Thompson worked throughout the battle, moved from wounded man to wounded man, applied tourniquets, packed wounds, administered morphine from the supply crates, saved 3 men who would have bled out without the new medical supplies. The supply drop was already paying dividends in lives. The Germans came in 3 waves. The first was probing, testing, looking for weak points. The second was committed, determined, came close to breaking through on the left before O'Brien's BR cut them apart. The third was desperate, a final push that spent itself against concentrated American fire. When it was over, the Germans had retreated, pulled back into the forest, licking their wounds, regrouping. They'd lost at least 20 men, maybe more. The clearing was scattered with German bodies, some still moving, most not. American casualties were lighter. 3 dead, 7 wounded, acceptable losses by combat standards, devastating by human standards. Each man had a name, a family, a future that ended in a frozen clearing because the Germans had found them first. Chen knew the dead. Private Patterson from Ohio, Private Sanchez from New Mexico, Corporal Williams from Georgia. All young, all scared, all dead now. Their bodies would be left behind, recovered later if possible, forgotten if not. That was the math of war. The living moved on. The dead stayed where they fell. Morrison found Chen after the fighting stopped. The lieutenant's uniform was torn, blood on his sleeve, not his own. He looked at Chen with something like awe. "You did it," Morrison said. "I don't know how, but you did it." Chen shook his head. "The pilot did it. I just talked." "You talked a plane through fog you couldn't see. You called a drop blind. You saved 32 men with a broken radio and your voice. That's not just talking, Chen. That's a miracle." Chen didn't know about miracles. He knew about radio frequencies and sound waves and desperate improvisation. He knew about doing your job when everything said it was impossible. He knew about 32 men who would have died without those supplies. That was enough. More than enough. That was everything. The platoon held their position until nightfall, used the hours to rest, to treat wounded, to bury the dead. Quick graves, shallow, marked with rifles stuck in the ground, dog tags left on the bodies for later recovery. It was the best they could do. Morrison planned the breakout during daylight, studied his maps, listened to German movements, identified a gap in the encirclement to the northwest, a ravine that might be passable, a route that might lead back to American lines. Chen's radio was crucial again. He contacted headquarters, got updated positions, learned where other American units were located, plotted a route that would minimize contact with German patrols, gave Morrison the information he needed to make good decisions. They moved out at 2100 hours, single file, silent, weapons ready, Chen in the middle of the column, radio on his back, antenna collapsed to avoid snagging branches, ready to call for help if they stumbled into another ambush. The night was black. Fog had lifted slightly, but the forest canopy blocked any starlight. Men navigated by touch, by sound, by following the man in front of them. One step at a time, 1 yard at a time, moving through enemy territory like ghosts. German patrols were everywhere. Twice the column froze as enemy soldiers passed within 30 yards. Men held their breath, gripped their weapons, waited for the shooting to start. It didn't. The Germans moved on, unaware, lucky. The ravine was the worst part. Steep sides, slippery with ice. Men fell, slid, grabbed roots and rocks to arrest their descent. The wounded had to be carried, lowered down with ropes made from rifle slings. It took 2 hours to cross 100 yards. Chen fell once. Radio caught on a root, yanked him backward. He tumbled 15 feet down the slope, landed hard. Wind knocked out of him. First thought was the radio. Checked it. Still working. Relief flooded through him. The radio was everything. Without it, they were blind. They reached American lines at 0300 hours on January 23rd. 29 men out of 32. 3 killed in the German assault. But 29 alive. 29 saved. Because of supplies that fell through fog. Because of a voice on a broken radio. Because David Chen did the impossible when impossible was the only option. Morrison wrote Chen up for a Bronze Star. The citation mentioned a supply drop, mentioned the fog, mentioned the 32 men saved, but it couldn't capture what really happened, couldn't describe the fear and the faith and the desperate improvisation, couldn't explain how a 20-year-old radio operator from San Francisco talked salvation out of the sky. The citation was typed on army forms, standard language, official terminology. Private First Class David Chen, under heavy enemy fire and adverse weather conditions, successfully guided a supply aircraft to an isolated position, enabling the delivery of critical supplies to surrounded personnel. His actions directly contributed to the survival of 32 soldiers and demonstrated exceptional skill, courage, and composure under fire. Words on paper. They didn't mention the shattered radio, didn't mention the fog so thick you couldn't see 30 yards, didn't mention the calculations done in his head based on sound alone, didn't mention the 5 seconds between calling the drop and watching the crates fall when Chen thought he'd killed everyone he was trying to save. The medal ceremony was brief. Field conditions, no parade, no speeches, just Morrison pinning the Bronze Star to Chen's jacket, a handshake, a thank you, then back to work, back to war, back to the endless grind of combat. Chen kept the medal, put it in a box with his other war souvenirs, a German bayonet he'd found in the forest, a French coin given to him by a grateful farmer, a photograph of his platoon before the Hürtgen, the faces of men who'd trusted him, some alive, some dead, all forever young in the fading image. He didn't talk about it much. What was there to say? He did his job. That's all. Just did his job. The same job his father had taught him. Listen, calculate, trust, execute. The physics never lies. Just do the work and let the results speak for themselves. But the results spoke loudly. 29 men walked out of the Hürtgen Forest. 29 men returned to their families. 29 men lived full lives because David Chen talked a plane through fog on a January morning, when fog should have made everything impossible. That was legacy. That was meaning. That was why the story mattered. Not for glory, not for recognition, just for the simple fact that impossible could be overcome. That one voice could change everything. That faith and skill and courage could beat the odds. David Chen beat the odds, and 29 men came home. But the men who were there remembered. They told the story, passed it down. The kid with the radio, the fog that wouldn't lift, the voice that brought supplies from the sky. A legend grew around that morning. A story about courage and skill and refusing to give up. Chen didn't feel like a legend, felt like a survivor, felt lucky to be alive, felt grateful for the pilot who trusted his guidance, for Morrison who gave him the chance, for his father who taught him about radios and persistence and doing the job one step at a time. The war went on, more battles, more close calls, more friends lost. Chen survived them all, made it through the Hürtgen, through the final push into Germany, through WWII Day and the celebrations and the long journey home. He returned to San Francisco in August 1945. His mother was waiting at the dock, crying, holding him like she'd never let go. His sisters were there too, grown up now. Different, changed by years of war and waiting, but still family, still home. The city had changed too. More people, more noise, more energy. The war had brought industry to San Francisco, shipyards and factories and workers from all over the country. The quiet Chinatown of Chen's childhood was surrounded now by bustle and growth. But Grant Avenue was still there. The electronics shop was still there. His mother had kept it running, hired a cousin to do the repairs, kept the doors open, kept the family fed. She'd done it for 4 years, waiting for her son to come home, believing he would, against the odds, against the statistics, against everything that said half the boys who went to war wouldn't return. Chen took over the shop in September. His cousin went back to Los Angeles. The familiar smell of solder and ozone welcomed him. The workbench where his father had taught him was still there. The tools, the test equipment, the radios waiting for repair, everything the same as when he left. Everything different because he was different. His hands remembered the work. Circuit tracing, component testing, soldering, rewiring. The skills came back quickly. The patience took longer. War had taught him urgency, combat speed, the need to fix things fast or people died. Civilian repairs didn't have that pressure. He had to slow down, remember that a broken radio wasn't life or death, just inconvenience. His mother watched him adjust, saw the way he startled at loud noises, the way his eyes scanned constantly for threats, the way he sometimes stared at nothing, lost in memories. She didn't ask about the war, didn't push, just fed him, made tea, kept the household running, let him heal in his own time. Chen took over his father's shop, fixed radios and televisions for the next 40 years, married a woman named Helen, had 3 kids, built a quiet life in the city he'd grown up in, never moved away, never wanted to. San Francisco was home, always had been, always would be. Helen was a school teacher, second-generation Chinese-American like Chen. They'd met at a community center dance in 1947. She'd been wearing a blue dress. He'd been too nervous to ask her to dance. Finally did. Stepped on her feet twice. Apologized. She'd laughed, said she didn't mind. 3 months later they were engaged. They married in 1948. Small ceremony, family and friends from Chinatown. Chen's mother cooked for 3 days. The reception was in the community center where they'd met, same floor where he'd stepped on Helen's feet, same music, better dancing. Their first child came in 1950, Michael, named after Chen's father, whose English name had been Michael. The baby was healthy, strong, cried a lot. Chen walked him through the night when Helen needed sleep, sang Chinese lullabies his mother had sung to him, felt something shift in his chest. A weight he hadn't known he was carrying lifted slightly. 2 more children followed. Susan in 1952, James in 1955. The house filled with noise and chaos and life. Chen navigated fatherhood the way he navigated everything, carefully, patiently, listening more than speaking, trying to understand before acting. The shop thrived. Word spread. Chen was the best radio repairman in Chinatown. Maybe in the whole city. People brought him equipment no one else could fix. Old tubes, rare circuits, problems that stumped everyone else. Chen would sit with them, listen, feel his way to the solution. Same as his father had taught him, same as he'd done in the Hürtgen when everything depended on getting it right. Television came in the 1950s. Chen learned to repair those too. Bigger tubes, more complex circuits. But the principles were the same. Diagnose, test, replace, repair. The technology changed, but the fundamentals held. He didn't talk about the war much, not to his wife, not to his kids, not to the customers who came into his shop. What was there to say? The war was over. The past was past. Better to focus on the present, on the repairs that needed doing, on the family that needed raising, on the life that needed living. Helen understood. She had uncles who'd fought, knew men who'd come back different, knew some things couldn't be talked about, just lived with, accepted, accommodated. She gave Chen space when he needed it, held him when the nightmares came, never asked questions he couldn't answer. But sometimes late at night he'd think about the Hürtgen, about the fog and the radio and the voice of that pilot, about 32 men who almost died in a frozen forest, about the moment when he called the drop and didn't know if it would work, about the 4 crates falling through the fog, about salvation landing 10 feet from a purple smoke grenade. He'd wonder if he could do it again, if he'd have the courage, the skill, the faith. Probably not, he decided. That was a young man's miracle. A desperate moment that demanded everything and somehow received it. Lightning doesn't strike twice. You don't get that lucky again. But once was enough. Once saved 32 men. Once proved that impossible was just a word. Once changed the course of 29 lives, including his own. That was Chen's war. Not the battles or the medals or the stories. Just one morning in January. One broken radio. One voice in the fog. One impossible task completed against all odds. The years turned Chen's black hair grey, turned his steady hands shaky, turned the young soldier into an old man, but the memory stayed sharp, clearer than yesterday sometimes. The fog, the radio, the fear, the faith. His children grew up hearing pieces of the story, not the whole thing. Chen never told the whole thing, just fragments, just hints. Enough to know their father had done something important, something worth remembering. Michael asked the most questions. Oldest son's privilege. He wanted to know about the war, about combat, about what his father had done. Chen gave careful answers, edited for content, left out the worst parts. The death, the fear, the way men screamed when they were hit, the way bodies looked after artillery. He gave Michael the story without the trauma, the heroism without the horror. Susan and James asked less, different personalities. Susan was practical, focused on the present. James was artistic, more interested in his drawings than in old war stories. Both knew their father had served. Both respected it. Neither pressed for details. The Thanksgiving conversation in 1975 was different. Michael was 35 now. Married, father of two, old enough to understand things he couldn't have understood at 10 or 15, old enough to hear the truth. His oldest son Michael asked about it directly. Thanksgiving 1975. The whole family gathered, turkey and stuffing and questions about the past. Dad, what was the scariest moment of the war for you? Chen thought about it. So many scary moments. The initial ambush, the German assaults, the nighttime escape through enemy lines, the countless engagements before and after the Hürtgen. But one moment stood above the rest. Calling the drop, he said finally, telling the pilot when to release the supplies. I couldn't see anything, couldn't see the plane, couldn't see the clearing, just had to guess based on sound, and I knew if I was wrong 32 men would die. But you weren't wrong, Michael said. No, I wasn't wrong, but I didn't know that until the crates landed. For about 5 seconds I thought I'd killed everyone. The table was quiet. Helen watched her husband's face, saw the old pain there, saw him reliving a moment from 30 years ago. She reached over, took his hand, squeezed. Michael nodded. Tried to understand. Couldn't really. How could anyone who wasn't there understand? The weight of 32 lives, the impossibility of the task, the miracle of getting it right. How did you do it? Michael asked. How did you know when to call the drop? Chen smiled. The same smile he wore when explaining a tricky repair. Your grandfather taught me. Not about supply drops. About listening. About patience. About trusting your instincts when the equipment fails. He fixed radios his whole life. Taught me that sometimes you have to feel your way to the answer. Can't always see it. Can't always measure it. Just have to know. And you knew? I guessed. Educated guess. Based on everything I'd learned. Everything I'd practiced. Everything I'd absorbed without realizing it. And I got lucky. That's not luck, Dad. That's skill. Chen shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe 32 men got lucky because a kid from San Francisco happened to have the right father. Hard to say. Either way, we're here. That's what matters. The conversation moved on. Other topics. Other stories. But Michael remembered, filed it away, told his own kids about it. Eventually, the grandfather they knew as a quiet man with steady hands. The great-grandfather who ran an electronics shop. The morning in the Hürtgen when one man's voice saved 32 lives. Stories like that don't die. They get passed down, changed a little with each telling, but the core remains. Courage, skill, faith, doing the impossible because impossible was the only option. Chen's wife Helen died in 1989, cancer, quick and brutal. Chen sat beside her until the end, held her hand, told her he loved her, watched her slip away like fog lifting from a forest. He'd faced death before, many times in the war, but this was different. This was slow. This was watching someone you loved disappear inch by inch. This was helplessness when you'd built your life on solving problems, on fixing things, on making broken equipment work again. Helen wasn't equipment, couldn't be fixed, just had to be mourned. The kids rallied around him. Michael came from Seattle, Susan from Los Angeles, James from Portland. They took turns staying with him, made sure he ate, made sure he slept, made sure he wasn't alone. Chen appreciated it, needed it. Without Helen, the house felt empty, the shop felt pointless, the days felt longer than they should. He sold the shop in 1991, retired properly, passed the business to a former apprentice who promised to maintain standards, spent his days reading, gardening, watching the grandchildren grow, simple pleasures, quiet life. The kind of life he'd fought for back in 1945, the kind of life 32 men got to have, because supplies fell through fog. The veterans started finding him in the 1990s. Men from the Platoon, men who'd been there. They'd tracked him down through army records, through veteran organizations, through the network that connects soldiers across decades and distances. First came a letter from Morrison. The lieutenant was living in Ohio now, retired schoolteacher, grandfather of 5. He wrote to thank Chen, 50 years late but heartfelt, said he'd never forgotten that morning, never forgotten the voice on the radio, never forgotten the miracle in the fog. The letter arrived on a grey Tuesday morning. Chen read it at his kitchen table, hands trembling slightly, not from age, from memory. Morrison's handwriting was neat, careful, teacher's penmanship. Dear David, the letter began. I've been meaning to write this for 50 years, never found the words, never had the courage, but I'm old now and time is running out, and some things need to be said. Chen read the whole letter. 3 pages, handwritten. Morrison described his life after the war, the teaching career, the wife who'd passed in 1980, the children and grandchildren who filled his house with noise and joy, all of it flowing from that morning in the Hürtgen, all of it possible because supplies fell through fog. I've thought about you often, Morrison wrote. Wondered what happened to you. Wondered if you remembered. Wondered if you understood what you did. I don't think you do, David. I don't think you ever understood how impossible it was, how nobody should have been able to do what you did. But you did it anyway, and 29 men lived because of it. The letter ended simply. Thank you for everything, for my children, for my grandchildren, for the 50 years of life you gave me. I will never be able to repay that debt, but I wanted you to know it exists. With deepest gratitude, James Morrison, Lieutenant Rhett. Chen wrote back. Brief letter, just acknowledgement. He wasn't comfortable with praise, wasn't comfortable being called a hero. He'd done his job, that's all. Just his job, same as his father had taught him, same as he'd taught himself. You do the work. You don't take credit. You move on. But Morrison's letter opened a door. Chen found himself thinking about the platoon more, about the men he'd served with, about what had happened to them in the 50 years since the Hürtgen. Some he knew about, most he didn't. He started making phone calls, writing letters, tracking down old soldiers through the same networks Morrison had used. It became a project, a purpose, something to fill the empty days after Helen's death. More letters came, more calls, more visitors, men who'd been in that clearing, men who'd survived because supplies landed. They wanted to shake his hand, thank him in person, tell him what his actions had meant. Rodriguez came first, the point man, still living in Texas, 80 years old but still sharp. He drove to San Francisco in 1993, showed up at Chen's door, 2 old men staring at each other, remembering who they'd been, young and scared and desperate in a frozen forest. You saved my life, Rodriguez said. Simple, direct, no elaboration needed. We saved each other, Chen replied. That's what soldiers do. They sat on Chen's porch, drank tea, talked about the old days, about the men who made it and the men who didn't, about families and careers and the decades that had passed. Rodriguez stayed 3 days, left as a friend instead of just a memory. Others followed. Thompson the medic, O'Brien the beer man, Kowalski's widow who came to thank Chen on behalf of her late husband. Each visit brought new stories, new perspectives, new pieces of a morning Chen had tried to forget but couldn't. A reunion was organized in 1995, 50th anniversary. 14 survivors gathered in Washington, D.C., old men now, grey and wrinkled and slow, but alive, all alive, because of that morning. They met at a hotel near the National Mall, sat around a conference table, stared at each other. Some faces familiar, some changed beyond recognition, but the bond was still there, could feel it humming beneath the surface. The connection that formed in combat, the brotherhood that never died. They shared stories, laughed about things that weren't funny at the time, cried about things that still hurt after 5 decades, remembered the dead, Patterson, Sanchez, Williams, the 3 who didn't make it, whose names were carved on walls now, whose families were invited but couldn't attend. They stood together at the World War II memorial, not completed yet but under construction. They looked at the site, imagined what it would become, knew they probably wouldn't live to see it finished. But that was okay. Memorials weren't for the dead. They were for the living, for remembering, for making sure the sacrifices meant something. Morrison gave a speech. Short, simple, to the point. His voice was steady, despite his 80 years. Teacher's voice, used to commanding attention. 50 years ago we were surrounded, out of ammunition, out of hope. One man changed that. One man with a broken radio and more courage than any of us knew existed. David Chen talked supplies out of the sky, talked us all back from the edge of death. We're here today because of him. Our children are here because of him. Our grandchildren. Everything we've built and loved and accomplished started in that clearing, started with his voice in the fog. The men applauded. Chen stood awkwardly, uncomfortable with the attention, with the credit, with being singled out. His Chinese upbringing said, don't stand out, don't take credit, be modest, be humble, let the group matter more than the individual. I just did my job, he said when they quieted. We all did our jobs, that's why we survived, not because of me, because of all of us, together. Morrison shook his head, smiled. That's like saying the bridge just did its job holding up the traffic. True, but the bridge still matters. You still matter, David. You saved us. Accept it. Chen tried to accept it, struggled with it for years. The weight of being called a hero, the responsibility of being someone's salvation. It didn't sit easily on his shoulders. Never had, probably never would. But he kept in touch with the survivors, wrote letters, made phone calls, attended reunions when he could. The bond held 50 years, 60 years, until one by one they started to pass. Morrison died in 2001, heart attack. Quick, painless. Chen got the call from Morrison's son, flew to Ohio for the funeral, stood at the grave and remembered the young lieutenant who'd trusted him, who'd given him the chance to save them all, who'd believed in him when belief was all they had. Others followed. Rodriguez in 2003, Thompson in 2005, O'Brien in 2007. Each death diminished the circle, thinned the ranks, left Chen more alone with the memory. By 2010, only 4 survivors remained. Chen was 85, still sharp mentally, still living in San Francisco, still tending his garden and reading his books and thinking about the fog, still keeping the memory alive because someone had to, because the dead couldn't remember themselves. His children wanted him to move. Come live with Michael in Seattle, or Susan in Los Angeles, or James in Portland, anywhere with family nearby, anywhere safer than a house alone. Chen refused. This was his home. Helen was buried here. His father was buried here. His memories were here. He'd die here too, in San Francisco, where everything started, where everything would end. He thought about the war more in those final years, about the friends he'd lost, about the friends he'd saved, about the morning in the Hürtgen, when everything balanced on his voice. The old SCR 300 radio still sat in his closet, the one he'd carried through the Hürtgen. He'd brought it home after the war, repaired it over the years, kept it working out of some stubborn loyalty, some connection to the past. It hadn't transmitted in decades, but it worked. The tubes glowed when he turned it on. The dials moved. The static hissed, still alive, like him, still functioning, barely, but enough. Sometimes he'd turn it on, listen to the static, remember what it felt like to key the mic and talk to a plane he couldn't see, remember the pilot's voice, calm and professional, trusting him completely. Remember the moment when he called the drop and didn't know what would happen? Drop! 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 3 words that changed everything. 3 words that saved 32 lives. 3 words that echoed across 65 years. Still resonating. Still meaning something. Still defining who David Chen was and why his life mattered. Chen died in 2012, 90 years old, peaceful, in his sleep. His children found him the next morning, still in his bed, still in his home, still in San Francisco, right where he wanted to be. The funeral was small, family and friends, a few veterans who could still travel. 3 survivors from the platoon made it, old men themselves now, leaning on canes, supported by grandchildren, but present, honoring the man who'd saved them 67 years before. The flag was folded and presented. Taps was played. Standard military honors for a soldier who'd served his country, for a man who'd done his duty, for a voice in the fog that brought 32 men home. Michael gave the eulogy, told the story of the Hürtgen, the fog, the radio, the impossible supply drop. He'd heard it many times now, knew it by heart, passed it on to the next generation, would pass it on until his own voice was silent. My father never thought of himself as a hero, Michael said. He just thought he did his job. But here's what I've learned. Sometimes doing your job is heroic. Sometimes showing up when everything is impossible is the bravest thing you can do. My father showed up. He keyed that mic when the fog was thick and the Germans were close and 32 men were counting on him. He called that drop blind, and he saved them all. The mourners nodded. Some cried, some remembered their own wars, their own impossible moments, their own times when showing up was all they could do, their own voices in their own fogs. They buried Chen next to Helen, next to his father, in the cemetery where his family had rested for generations. San Francisco soil, American soil, home. On his gravestone, they carved his name, his dates, his service, and one line that Michael insisted on, a line that captured everything his father had been, everything he'd done, everything he'd meant. His voice brought them home. Simple, true, complete. David Chen's whole war in 5 words, his whole legacy in 5 words, everything that mattered in 5 words. Because that's what he did. Talked to a pilot through fog, called a drop blind, brought supplies to surrounded men, brought hope to desperate soldiers, brought salvation from the sky, brought them home. His voice carried across 50 yards of clearing, across 300 feet of fog, across the decades that followed, still carrying, still reaching, still bringing them home. That's what courage sounds like. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, just persistent, just present when presence is impossible, just speaking when speaking might not matter, just trying when trying is all you have left. David Chen tried, on a frozen morning in January 1945, with a broken radio and shaking hands and 32 lives hanging on his words. He tried, and against all odds, against all reason, against everything that said it couldn't work, he succeeded. The supplies fell through fog. The men survived. The war continued. Life went on. But in that moment, in that clearing, in that fog, something permanent happened, something that transcended the war and the years and the fading memories. A young man found out what he was capable of, found out that impossible was just a word, found out that one voice could change everything. That's the story they tell about David Chen, the kid with the radio, the voice in the fog, the miracle of the Hürtgen Forest. It gets passed down through families, through veteran organizations, through anyone who hears it and understands what it means. Courage isn't always charging into battle. Sometimes it's sitting still, keying a mic, speaking into fog, trusting that your voice will reach someone who can help, trusting that help will come, trusting that impossible isn't permanent. David Chen trusted, and 32 men lived. Their children lived, their grandchildren lived, a whole cascade of lives flowing from one moment of faith, one moment of skill, one moment of doing the job when the job seemed impossible. That's legacy. That's meaning. That's what happens when one person refuses to give up. The fog lifted eventually. It always does, but the story remains, clear and bright and permanent. A voice in the darkness, a miracle in the mist. A young man who saved 32 lives with nothing but a radio and the courage to speak. His children carry the story now, tell it to their own children, who will tell it to theirs. The details might change, the numbers might shift, but the core will remain. A man, a radio, a fog, an impossible task completed, because impossible was not an acceptable answer. Michael still has the old SCR 300, keeps it in his garage in Seattle. Turns it on sometimes, listens to the static, imagines his father's voice cutting through, calling the drop, bringing men home. The radio doesn't transmit anymore, but it remembers. In some way Chen would have understood. The equipment holds the memory, carries the history, keeps the story alive. Susan has her father's bronze star, framed on her wall in Los Angeles. The citation underneath describes what happened. The words are formal, military language. They don't capture the fear or the faith or the impossible mathematics of dropping supplies through fog onto a clearing you couldn't see. But they acknowledge it happened, acknowledge that it mattered, acknowledge that David Chen did something worth remembering. James has the photographs, album after album, his father's life documented in fading images, the young soldier in uniform, the wedding day with Helen, the children growing up, the grandchildren arriving, all of it flowing from that morning in the Hürtgen, all of it possible because supplies fell through fog. The family gathers every January 22nd. Not always, not every year, but when they can, they raise a glass to David Chen, to the men of the platoon, to the pilot of Boxcar 3 who trusted a voice in the fog. They tell the story again, add new details, laugh at old jokes, cry at old memories, keep the legacy alive. It's what families do, what survivors do, what anyone does when someone they loved did something worth remembering. They remember, they tell, they pass it on. And somewhere in the telling, in the passing, in the remembering, David Chen lives on, not as a legend, not as a hero, just as what he always wanted to be. A man who did his job, who showed up when it mattered, who spoke into the fog and brought men home. His voice brought them home. 5 words that echo across decades, that carry more weight than any medal, that mean more than any ceremony. 5 words that captured a lifetime of courage in a single phrase. The Hürtgen Forest is quiet now. The trenches have filled in. The shell craters have smoothed over. Trees have grown where men once bled. Nature has reclaimed what war destroyed, but the echoes remain. If you listen carefully, if you stand in the right spot, you can almost hear it. A voice in the fog calling the drop, bringing supplies, bringing hope, bringing salvation. Drop, drop, drop. 3 words that ended a siege. 3 words that saved 32 lives. 3 words that proved impossible was just a word, just a limitation, just something to overcome. David Chen overcame it, with a broken radio and steady voice and faith that what he was doing would work. He overcame the impossible because the impossible was unacceptable, because 32 men were counting on him, because his father had taught him to trust the physics, because soldiers don't give up, not when lives are on the line, not when hope is all that's left, not when one voice might make the difference. One voice did make the difference. One voice carried across 50 yards of frozen clearing, across 300 feet of fog, across 67 years of memory, still carrying, still reaching, still mattering. That's the power of courage. That's the weight of duty. That's what happens when ordinary people do extraordinary things in extraordinary circumstances. They become stories. They become legends. They become the examples we tell our children about. The proof that impossible can be overcome. The evidence that one person can change everything. David Chen changed everything. For 32 men in a frozen forest. For their families who waited at home. For the generations that followed. For everyone who hears the story and understands what it means. Courage speaks softly, does its job, moves on, doesn't ask for credit, doesn't demand recognition, just shows up when showing up matters most, just performs when performance is impossible, just trusts that doing the right thing will somehow work out. Sometimes it does. Sometimes supplies fall through fog and land exactly where they need to land. Sometimes voices carry through static and reach exactly who they need to reach. Sometimes the impossible becomes possible because someone refused to accept any other outcome. David Chen refused, and 32 men lived. Their children lived. Their grandchildren lived. Their great-grandchildren play in parks and go to schools and have no idea that they exist because a 20-year-old radio operator from San Francisco talked a C-47 pilot through fog on a January morning in 1945. But they exist. Because of him, because of his voice, because of his courage. His voice brought them home. The rest was just history.